So tech interviews can be really, really tough. There's a lot of pressure that can be put on you as you go in them, especially when you have to perform in real time and remember all the different pieces of technology and all the different things that you've learned and put them all into one and build something. So this is a simulated React question that tests you on multiple different things. This is probably a more complicated one that would take a junior much more time than just a phone screen. So this would be one that would be presented on site. But there are a handful of tips that I'll show you throughout the video that will really help you nail that front-end JavaScript interview. So with that, let's jump right in. So in this problem, we're going to simulate a real interview question when you're brought in on site as a React developer. So with this, we're going to make API calls and we're going to show our interviewer that we know how to set state and render things conditionally and render things in lists, and basically that we know our way around the React app. So the whole goal of the interview is to show the other person that you're proficient in the skills that you have. Now that doesn't mean perfecting every last bit of the app that you're making or making it look perfect with CSS. That means showing them that you know the core concepts to build this and make it functional. So at bare minimum, you want to get something working, and then if you have extra time, you can ask your interviewer what you can do to make the app better or what they would recommend you do in this time that you have left. So let's jump right in. So in here, we want to, basically, we're given some user stories and we want to build an app. So as a user, I want to see all JavaScript repos on GitHub with over 25,000 stars sorted by most to least or in order. As a user, I want to see the name, number of stars, and a link to the repo. And as a user, I want to know when the screen is loading. As a user, I want to know when I have an error. So basically, in this, we're going to have to make an API call, and we're going to have to look through some of the GitHub documentation to make sure we have what we need. So in an interview, step 1 is build a mental model. Step 2 is pseudocode. And step 3 is to write out actual code. And in the interview process, you want to be talking and thinking aloud and showing your interviewer that you're engaging. Now, one thing that I've seen when I interview people is that if they come in and they're coding silently, that's a pretty big red flag. I want to hear them. I want to hear what they think. I want to hear the caveats that they've gone through. I want them to ask questions, debunk edge cases, things like that. And the best way to do that is to talk out loud and engage your interviewer. So what we'll do first is make a mental model of the problem that we're solving. So if we split this side by side, as a user, I want to see all JavaScript repos with over 25k stars sorted. So over here, we know that we need some kind of view. So this is our app, and this app needs to make an API call to GitHub, which then needs to return and display data. And since we have a bunch of repos, we need to display this in some kind of list or table. And we know it has to be sorted. And the last thing is we want to know when the screen is loading or has an error. So there are going to be 3 different states that we can have, and that's loading, error, and the success state, which is going to display the data. So now that we've seen this, it's a pretty simple problem. So we'll just have to take some time understanding how the API works and figure out a plan for rendering this data. So going back here, what we can do is step by step build out how we're going to approach this. So we know that we need to make a request. So we need to create a query, and we actually have this right here. So create a query and make an API call on app load. And then we need to parse the data. And when we get data back, we always set it to state. So we need to set to state. And after that, we then need to display data in some manner. And lastly, we need to handle loading and error states. Okay, so now that we've done that, we can go through step by step and write out our stub functions and figure out how everything works. So we have this URL right here, and we can paste this in and see what it gives us. So it gives us a huge JSON object with a bunch of different parameters. So if you go on the GitHub documentation, you can kind of see how this query is built and how this works. So we have our parameters up here. We have a queue parameter, a sort, and order. So the queue is a query, and it's a string. The sort is a string, and the order is a string. So if we're looking at this right now, so we have our base, which is search repositories, and then this question mark is where our query starts. So we have queue equals, and then our query all the way up here, and then this and signifies there's another parameter, so and sort equals stars, and order equals descending. So we can actually model our call right off of this. So we know for a fact that we want to see JavaScript repos with over 25,000 stars, sorted by most to least order. So we know that we want to sort by stars, and we want order descending, but now we need to figure out what we'll do for our queries. So we can jump in here and copy this, and now we can look at this other page to kind of see how to deal with stars. So let's look for stars. Okay, perfect. So up here, it looks like our query is built with stars and then greater than whatever number you want. So we can grab that, and we want greater than 25k stars. So stars are greater than 25k. And then it looks like we know we want our JavaScript language, and they already have language equals assembly here. So what we can do is replace that with language equals JavaScript. And then we know that we want stars are greater than 25,000. So plus allows us to add two different search terms together here. So we can just replace this first search term with stars greater than 25,000. So the way this is broken up is you have your question mark, you have your query, which is this all the way up to that first and point, and then second and point. So this is your queue, this is your stars, this is your order, and our string is built up of sub search terms. So the sub term is going to say star are more than 25k, and then language is JavaScript. So that's basically how this is built. So if we go all the way back here, we can grab this and test it out by pasting it in the browser. And boom, we have our total count, we have a list of items, these are all of our repos. And then if we go here, we want name, number of stars, and link to the repo. So name, number of stars, and link. Let's look through our data and get a sense of what's coming back, and then let's figure out what we need to pull out. So we go down here, we look, so this big item right here, this big object, this is one repo in our items array. So if you look here, we know that we have our full name, so that's going to be useful. And then we want number of stars, so let's scroll through and see where the numbers are right here. So size, stargazers count, perfect. So that's what we want right here, so stargazers count. And then we also want a link. So let's figure out where our link is. So we have a bunch of URLs here, a ton of URLs. We have this URL, but if we click this, it just brought us to another JSON object, which is not what we want. So let's see if they have anything else. They have mergers URL, let's see, keys, URL forks. So there has to be some other kind of URL that we can use. Okay, so if we look here, so we have this URL, but let's grab this and paste it in the browser to see what happens. And it doesn't bring us to the actual repo page, it brings us another huge piece of JSON. So what we can do now is keep searching. So this one, HTML URL, looks pretty promising. So let's open this, and boom, it brings us the page. So this is the exact one that we want. And then, as we know, when we map over items in an array, we usually need a unique ID if we're not using the index. So what we can do here for that is we can just grab the ID and store that as well. So now we have all the variables that we need from this repo. So We have created our query up here, and we have our pieces of info. So now we need to make an API call on app load. So we can use the fetch API to make this call and get back our data. And we know that we have to do this on app load. So what we can do is using the new use effect hook, we can make our API call. So use effect make API call, and what we can do is we can pull up that API call into its own function. So what we can do here is we can write our functions. We have function and then get GitHub repos. And what we can do now is we can make an API call using the fetch API. So fetch, and then we need to pass in this right here. So this full URL that we've made. And after that, we need to chain that with the dot then. And one of the caveats with the fetch API is that you need to first grab your data and you need to return data.json. Now we have working data that we can work with. So we can then chain along then again. Once this is done, it will pass it over here. So we can say results, and what we want to do is just test that we have this. So one of the key things in an interview is testing along the way to make sure that you have all the right data step by step. You don't want to rush through, get to the end, and realize that your app is completely broken because you haven't been validating that you've been getting the correct things throughout the whole time you've been coding. So now we can go back to our React app, and in the console, we can then call GitHub repos, and we have all of our items right here. So that fulfills that step. So now we know that we need to make this API call on app load, and what we can do is using the use effect hook, we can call this right when the app loads up. So up here, grab use effect, and we know that in our app, to do this on load, we need to call this use effect hook, and what this does is it takes in a callback. And we know with use effect that we only want to call this once. So what we can do down here is we can pass in an empty array. So this means that this effect does not depend on any props or state changes, so it will only run once. And what we can do here is we can now call our get GitHub repos function. And we know that this will return a promise. So here we can say dot then, and then we'll say results, and then console.log results. So we basically done the same thing with the then chaining up here, and we've just moved it down here. It's pretty much the same exact thing because this returns a promise anyway. So now when the app loads, let's see what the issue is, then of undefined. So here we want to return this promise. So this resolves to a promise, and we're going to return this promise. So once this is invoked and this turns into a promise, we can now chain this with the dot then. So on load, it makes the API call, and boom, we have all our data here. So we look in here, this is one repo. Okay, so next we need to parse the data, set the data to state, and display the data in some manner. So what we can do is right in here, just to save some time, we can parse the data currently. And what we need to do is, since this is an array of objects, we can map over this. So we can say results. And one quick thing is that we know that what we're getting back is this, and our array is in the items key. So we need to say results.items. And then now this will be our array of repos. And then we can say .map. And what we can call this is, we can say repo. So we can call this results.items.map, and this is a repo. And what we can do now is just return repo and test that out. So now this should spit out all the repos if we console log them. Boom, so we have all our repos. So what we want to do is we want to pull out these specific pieces of data from each of the objects, the repo objects. So I'll show you a quick trick on how to do that. So we'll go up here and we can use destructuring. So what this will do is we can take our different lists and we can destructure them from those big repo objects. So if we only want this, what we can do is we can replace our repo. So this will be the object coming in the map function. So what we can do is we can actually pull out each of these specific pieces of data that we want. And I'll show you exactly how this works. So here, this is a really clean trick to show that you're getting exactly what you want. So you pass in the full object. What this does is it splits off each of these certain pieces of data. And then what we can do is we can basically strip those objects down and turn them into something really clean and concise. So we can grab this and we can go down here and return this. So I'll show you exactly what this does. So this returns a list of your objects, and now they're stripped down. So what you've done here is you grabbed your full repo object. You've pulled out full name, stargazer count, HTML URL, and ID from each of those. And now you've gone down here and you've created a brand new object, which will be replacing the old object, but it only has the full name property. So this is the key and then the value it resolves to. The stargazer's count property, so the key and then the value that we've grabbed from up here. And then again, the key and the value that we've grabbed from up here, and the key and the value that we've grabbed from up here. So what I can do is I'll show you exactly how that works, and we can just console log these objects as they're going through. So console.log, and then over here. So boom, so we open this. This is the same thing as a repo object, except it's now stripped down to only have the exact data that we need. So full name, HTML URL, ID, and stargazer's count. So that's pretty much that for parsing the data. Now we have to set this to state. So we know that we have the useState hook, and what we need to do is the top of our app, we need to create our value. So this is a repo list technically, and then we need our setter function, which will be passing in the new list to update this value. So what we can do here is we'll just call it set repo list, and then we can pass in our initial value, which will be an empty array here. So we pass in our new value to our empty so we pass in our new value to this setter method, and it updates this value, which we can then reuse throughout our app. So now when we go in here, we're basically just returning the filtered list. So down here we can go ahead and chain on another .then, and then we can say repo list, and as a result of this callback, we can grab the set repo list function and we can pass in repo list. So now what this will do is it will set our brand new repo list that we've grabbed and place it up here. So that takes care of that piece. Now once we get down here to display the data in some manner, we can console.log the repo list and make sure that we're getting exactly what we want. Okay, so now we have an error. So results.items.map.then is not a function. So, okay, here's the issue. So with promises, you want to make sure you don't do internal nesting for chaining. And this is something that the more you code, the more you'll realize when you're in an interview setting and find a bug and you look through it, you'll be able to pick this up over time with a lot of practice. So right now what we've done is we haven't chained this in the correct place. So right now we're chaining this inside the nested area, but since ultimately this .then results callback is going to be returning this whole piece of info, we actually need to go down here and nest it here. So now you can see that this is not nested. So this is in the same line here, and then we can go set the repo list. And boom, we now have everything we need. So that's another thing when you get caught on a bug in an interview, take a deep breath and really look it over, think about it, think of some caveats of whatever technology you're using, and why it could be working that way. And don't stress about it, because bugs are normal. And actually, if you go in and solve a bug, that shows your interviewers so much, because they know that you know how to tackle a bug. Your code is not supposed to be perfect all the time. It's just unrealistic. So now let's go through and display the data in some manner. So that we can create a table. So we'll make our first div, and this will say hello, just so we can keep something there. And now we can add in our tables. So our table has a table and a table body. And inside here, we need our table rows, table headers, and table data. So inside our T body, we can, so inside our T body, we can make our first set of table headers. Since we know exactly what they are, we can make this, we'll just do it really, really quickly. So we know that our data is going to come back with a full name as said above, and a number of stars, as well as a language. As well as a link. So we'll just call this link. So what we have here is we have our table body, and then these are our headers. So we have our row here with our name, full name, stars, and link. So that's the first piece that we need. And the second piece is we're going to need to fill in these rows with the data. So we can actually remove that div. So we need to fill in these rows with the data. And we already know that we have our repo list right here with all of its data. So full name, URL, ID, and Stargazer's account. And what we can do here is map through our huge list and display these to the page. So right under this table row, we need to add in our map function. And we know that we have our repo list, so repo list.map, and we have our repo. And here's where things get a little bit tricky, but they're pretty straightforward if you look through it. So here we want our table row, and we want our table data. So table data is where you place each of your data that goes under a table header. So we know that we have 3 table headers, so this also needs to be matched up with 3 table data pieces. And we know that each of our repo has a full name. So this right here, this whole thing is a repo object. So this is a full name, HTML URL, and ID. So what we can do here is we can say repo.fullname and repo.stargazer's count, and then we can say repo.html URL. And now that we've saved this, let's see, saw an expression. So we actually need to return this JSX inside of parentheses. And now that we've done that, we can see what we have. So this is working out perfectly. So we have all of our data right here. So another quick thing is we have to just turn these into links. So what we can do is we can say a href, and then we can pass in our repo HTML URL also into the href. And we can now close off our link. So this is just nesting a link inside of our table data. So now we have this here, and now these are all clickable, which is great. So we can open this, click that. Okay, so that is good. We have all our names, all our stars, all our links sorted by stars. So now let's see what else we have to do. So we need to know when the screen is loading, and also know when we have an error. So what we can do here is, if this is loading, so we need to have three different states. So if we jump back into here, we have our loading state, our error state, and our success state. So our error state is when something would come back with an empty array. Our success state is when we have a filled array, so that's this up here. And our loading state has to be something else. So what we can actually do here is we can start off with null and then do a check. And we can up here say if repo list is equal to null, then we can just display a div that says loading. So super simple, doesn't really take much thinking. And then down here, we'll actually use a conditional, so a ternary. So if repo list is null, then display the text loading, else, and this is where we can wrap our table. So what we can do is jump back here, loading, and then boom. Now you can do spinners, there are all these things you can do with loading, but since you're in an interview and you want to show everyone that you're proficient in what you're doing, you can do this quickly. If they want you to refactor it later, sure, that's totally fine. Go through and make it how they want it. But right now the goal is to just get through and show that you know how to do exactly what they want. So now we have a warning, each child in the list shall have a unique key prop, and this is where our ID will come in. So, okay, so I think what we have to do here actually is we have to wrap this in a React fragment and add an ID prop here. Boom, there's that. And we need to import our fragment. So this is kind of like a dummy wrapper. It's not, doesn't resolve to a div, but let's see. So it's a dummy wrapper for application that won't actually show anything on the displayed page. So now let's try this. Invalid ID can only have a key. Oh, right, key. Okay, so we fixed that error. We have everything. We have our loading state. Now the next thing to do is to handle the error states. So this is one thing that we need to think about is what happens when there is an error. And the way that the promises work, or you can add a catch-all, which will go through and catch any errors. So we know that we want our loading state to be an empty array. So what we can do here is for the error state, we can have a catch handler which sets the state to an empty array, and then we have to check in our JSX and display that there's an error. Okay, so what we can do here is inside of useEffect, we can chain on a .catch, and here we can use our error and we can do what we need with it. So here inside of our catch statement, we have our error and we can console log our error. And what we can do is we can test this by saying throw new error, and we can say my error. And let's see what this does. So we go through unreachable, code unreachable, my error. So we have our error right here. So whenever you have an error, we actually want to go through and just set the state to an empty object. So set this to, empty list. So once we've done this, we have our empty list. So down here, what we can say is the first check, if it's not null, it will be loading. Now we can do a nested ternary, and we can say, so if repo list dot length is greater than 0, then we want to display our table. Else we want to display our error. So what we can do here, we can just display a friendly message to the user that says error, please try again. Okay, so now on the screen, because we threw a new error here, we're kind of mocking how an error would work. We will catch it and we'll set the repo list to an empty list, and then down here we'll display the error to a user. So boom, error, please try again. So that worked there. So this is pretty much how you want to approach your interview problems. Now there are a handful of other things you could do, like if you got back an empty list from GitHub, you could say no results found, handle a case like that. That's something that you can have a dialogue with your interviewer about. You can ask them what edge cases should you be handling after you've told them what edge cases you think they have. There are a handful of other things you can, pretty up the app. You can do whatever else you might need to do. But the most important thing is the communication aspect and showing them that you can think through problems and that you know how to handle them. So if you have any questions, shoot them down in the comments below, and make sure to like this video and subscribe if you want to see more. I have a handful of other React interview questions that you can see here on the end screen, so make sure to check those out and beef up your React interview skills.